I would like to thank Jocelyn for all his help in bringing me here, and Marc-Andre. He's sort of the reason that I'm here today. God, we say that horribly in English, don't we? Marc-Andre. Okay, so I'm just going to get into it here. But before we get into the actual presentation, I'm going to just set the stage with a bit of context. So first, you'll likely notice that the first half of the presentation focuses on pieces of history that are going to seem very unrelated to recreation. But as I'm going to demonstrate in the second half of the presentation, these seemingly unrelated pieces of history have actually shaped, and they continue to shape, our recreation systems across Canada. The second thing to note, given the nature of the information that I'm going to be sharing, is that some of you might have an emotional response. This has been a very common reaction to my work. If the content is triggering and you feel you need to leave, please do so. People have had to do that in the past. Also, if you find yourself feeling defensive or angry, I just ask that you do some self-reflection and examine why you might be feeling this way, rather than projecting those feelings towards me or others. This has also happened in the past. The last thing I'd like to note is that this type of historical work is really intended to be hopeful. So as the historian Robin Kelly wrote in Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, social movements do not simply produce statistics and narratives of oppression. Rather, the best ones do what great poetry always does: transport us to another place, compel us to relive horrors, and more importantly, enable us to imagine a new society. So it's therefore at this intersection of hope and resistance that I offer what I call a rereading of recreation history, which begins with a passage from A Framework for Recreation in Canada. And I actually just learned today that Marc-Andre is the human who wrote this passage. So on page 18 of the framework, it reads, "Through much of the 20th century, public recreation was regarded as a public good. The emphasis was on accessibility for all, outreach to disadvantaged groups, and a belief in the universal benefits to the whole community, not just to users. In the 1990s, recreation departments and organizations came under increasing pressure for cost recovery and revenue generation, including increases in user fees. Since then, leaders in recreation have continued to stress the need for equitable recreation experiences for all, with a call for the renewed importance of public recreation's historic mandate of addressing the inclusion of vulnerable populations." So as we can see in that passage, the framework is calling for a return to a time when recreation was considered a public good available to all. Statements like these are not new. Academics and professionals have been making similar calls since the mid to late 1980s. Specifically, they've been calling on the recreation sector to resist the principles of neoliberalism. Tony talked about this a little bit, but for those of you that haven't or aren't familiar with this term, it can basically be understood as a political framework that stresses profitability, efficiency, and individualism, and return to, quote, "the social liberal values that have historically driven our field." It's important to note here that the central assumption underlying these calls for the recreation profession to return to its historical roots is that municipal recreation services up until the 1980s were actually available to all members of society. However, as I'm going to demonstrate, this is a very, very romantic account of a so-called inclusive past. So like most other activities that helped build and secure the Canadian state, public recreation has always been and continues to be an exclusionary site linked to the oppressive and harmful logics of white supremacy. So I recognize that this claim might feel a bit extreme at the moment. So in order to demonstrate exactly how a benevolent institution like public recreation has been and continues to be linked to such harmful logics, I'm going to begin by providing a very, very brief overview of 4 seemingly unrelated threads of Canadian history. So I'm going to talk a bit about Indigenous legislation, I'll move into immigration policy, go into citizen rights and social programs, and end with some historical scientific knowledges. So as most of you likely already know, Canadian sovereignty, like other settler colonial states, was accomplished and sustained through a series of struggles between colonizers. So for us, that was primarily the British, and to a significantly lesser degree, the French, and the colonized, so Indigenous peoples. And despite what many traditional histories tell us, settler colonialism was neither a peaceful nor a collaborative process. As I'm going to demonstrate in the following slides, the British, which later became the Canadian government, legislated and institutionalized various forms of violence in order to establish and maintain the racial, economic, political, and cultural dominance required to develop a predominantly British settler society on Indigenous territories. So I've just got a few pieces of legislation to do this, starting with the 1749 Scalping Proclamation. So this was a piece of legislation that gave the government of Nova Scotia the ability to provide financial rewards for the scalps and bodies of Indigenous peoples. So it was essentially a form of legalized and incentivized murder. Next, we've got the 1850 Act for the Better Protection of Lands and Property. And what this piece of legislation did was give the British Commissioner of Indian Lands the power to determine who had Indigenous status and therefore what lands they were able to live on, hunt on, and farm. So it was essentially a legalized form of segregation that not only separated Indigenous peoples from European settlers, but also limited access to food and land rights. The next example there is the 1876 Indian Act. So what this act did was actually consolidate all of the existing Indigenous legislation into one very comprehensive document. In doing so, Indigenous peoples who had not assimilated, so that is those status Indians who refused to become British citizens at the time, were deemed wards of the state. So this meant that their day-to-day activities were managed and controlled by the British government with the overall goal of erasing their entire culture. There are a variety of examples I could have used to demonstrate how this piece of legislation sought to erase Indigenous people's culture, but the three that are listed here I chose simply because they are relevant in a recreation context. So in 1876, the potlatch ceremony, which is an Indigenous gift-giving feast, was banned. In 1914, all off-reserve dancing was banned, and in 1925, Indigenous dancing was banned across Canada altogether. It is worth noting that the Indian Act was modernized in 1951 and 1985, but it's actually still in effect today and the primary piece of legislation that governs Indigenous peoples. The next example there is the pass system. So the pass system was a federal policy that kept Indigenous peoples confined to reserves by requiring them to obtain a pass from a federal Indian agent in order to leave and return. It was in effect until the early 1940s. So for approximately 60 years, this policy controlled the movement of Indigenous peoples with the goals of, again, keeping them on reserves and away from settlers. And then the last example I have in this section is residential schools. So as most of us know by now, these were mandatory government-funded schools where thousands of Indigenous children and youth died from abuse, starvation, and treatable illnesses. The last school only closed in 1996, and just for some context, I was 13 years old at that time. So as we can see from just these few examples that I've pulled, it's through legal forms of bodily, cultural, and administrative violence that the Canadian state was able to secure control over Indigenous lands, eliminate their claims to Indigenous sovereignty, and absorb Indigenous peoples into the colonial regime that sought to erase their entire culture. Immigration policies, on the other hand, operated very differently. So unlike Indigenous peoples, immigrants were constituted by the British, and then again later the Canadian government, as an external rather than an internal threat. It's for this reason that Indigenous peoples and immigrants were governed, so that is controlled and eliminated, in very different ways. So in an immigration context, the first exclusions were economic exclusions. They therefore focused on limiting the landing of those individuals, quote, diseased, worn out, and unprofitable, making them incapable of useful labor and honest industry. So this resulted in legislation that was intended to limit the landing of individuals considered to be incapable of supporting themselves in a capitalist society. So according to the 1848 Immigration Act, this included anyone too diseased to work, children without parents, anyone over 60, unwed mothers, and then anyone the government decided to label, quote, a lunatic, idiot, deaf, dumb, or blind. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, racialized exclusions became just as important as the previous economic ones. So prior to this, pretty much any immigrant who could be put to work was treated as a tolerable asset in Canadian nation building. An excellent example of this can be found in the healthy Chinese men that were given immigrant status to do the dangerous and often life-ending work of building the Canadian Pacific Railway. But as the racist and ableist discourses of eugenics, so for those of you that aren't familiar with this term, eugenics is a pseudoscientific program that sought to increase the number of Canadians considered physically, mentally, and morally fit, so which was basically code for white, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied Christians, while eliminating those considered physically, mentally, and morally unfit. So meaning anyone who was non-white, disabled, gay, transgender, or non-Christian. So as these racist and ableist discourses of eugenics became more popular, so too did the programs and policies that sought to eliminate all, quote, degenerates from the population. So this resulted in a number of new immigration policies that were intended to secure what John A. Macdonald called the Aryan character of future British America. So again, I've just got a few examples to demonstrate how we used legislation to do this. The first is the 1885 Chinese Immigration Act. So this piece of legislation introduced a head tax of $50. It's about the equivalent of $1,500 in today's standards, in an attempt to reduce the number of Chinese immigrants coming into Canada. The logic behind the act was that Chinese individuals, especially those that could not afford the tax, were not evolved enough to achieve the intellectual and moral expectations of the superior white civilization we were creating here in Canada. The next example I have is the 1910 Immigration Act. So as written directly in this act, this piece of legislation prohibited the landing of immigrants belonging to any race unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada. So in other words, this piece of legislation restricted immigration from warmer, non-white countries in Africa, South Asia, and Southern Europe without having to actually use explicitly racist language. And then the last piece of legislation there is the 1919 Act to amend the Immigration Act. And within this piece of legislation, anyone deemed, quote, undesirable because of customs, habits, or modes of life, so very subjective things, were now prohibited from immigrating to Canada. So in other words, anyone who threatened the purity of the population due to a lack of whiteness, Christianity, or capitalist lifestyle could be labeled un-Canadian by the government and denied entry. So this version of the act actually remained almost unchanged until 1976. In addition to developing this comprehensive system of immigration legislation that was intended to keep Canada white, the colonial state also used a number of laws and programs to reinforce both the superiority and security of white, heterosexual, able-bodied men. So again, just a few examples to demonstrate this. The first is the Electoral Franchise Act, and this act actually explicitly disenfranchised women, Indigenous people, and peoples of Chinese heritage. It also required people to earn an annual income and own or rent a house of specific value, which indirectly disenfranchised a number of French settlers, Black migrants, and Irish immigrants. It is worth noting that this version of the act was repealed in 1898. However, women still didn't get the federal vote until 1919. In many provinces, the provincial vote came a lot later. So for example, here in Quebec, women couldn't vote until 1940. Racialized exclusions were only removed in 1948, with the exception of Indigenous peoples who couldn't vote until 1960. And property-based qualifications for voting were not completely removed until 1948. So lots of exclusion in that piece of legislation. The next example is the 1890 Criminal Code. So within this code, male homosexuality was illegal until 1969. My dad was in grade 11 at that time, and he came out later in life, so I totally understand why now. In 1953, the prohibition was extended to women, meaning being a lesbian was also illegal from 1953 until 1969. And then the last example I have here is the 1944 Unemployment Insurance Act. So the purpose of this act was to provide financial assistance to unemployed persons. However, those who were ill, injured, pregnant, too old to work, were fired from their job, left their job without just cause, refused any type of employment regardless of the conditions, participated in strikes or work stoppages, or weren't previously employed full-time, were all ineligible for support under this act. So basically what this meant was that in addition to denying assistance to people who were sick, old, or pregnant, this so-called universal welfare program also excluded a number of women, racialized, and disabled people because they were more likely to lack full-time employment opportunities. It also excluded gay people who would have been fired because of their illegal sexuality, and anyone who was against exploitative labor practices and publicly supported unions. Again, this act remained almost relatively unchanged until 1971. So returning now to this idea of keeping Canada white, we can see how from the mid-1700s until the mid-1970s, the British and then later the Canadian government used a comprehensive system of legislation and policy that gave priority to white people over non-white people, cisgender men and boys over all other genders, heterosexuality over homosexuality, able working bodies over disabled non-working bodies, Christianity over all other religions, and the economy over humanity. It's important to note here, however, that these harmful and oppressive acts of legislation were not simply based on a few beliefs of racist politicians. Science, like the law, was also used to justify these legal acts of elimination and control. So again, just a few examples, starting with the 1758 Systema Natura. So this was published by a guy named Carl Linnaeus. He's known now as the father of taxonomy. And this scientific text used geography to divide the human species into 4 hierarchical types. So at the top we had European white, American reddish, Asian tawny, and then African black. So within this hierarchy, Europeans were constituted as morally and physically superior and were placed at the top. Africans, on the other hand, were constituted as having the most negative moral and physical attributes, so they were consistently placed at the bottom. The next example I have is the 1799 Human Chart. So this was published by a man named Charles White, and this chart was based on a number of abstract skull measurements that again ordered human varieties according to what was called the Great Chain of Being. So this was a scientific hierarchy that placed God at the top and then progressed downwards to animals, plants, and minerals. So using this sort of hierarchy, he created his own chart, which included the following categories: Grecian antique, Roman painter, European, Asian, American savage, Negro, and ape. So once again, the order is really important to note here. By situating the Negro alongside the ape and Europeans alongside the godlike figures of the Roman painter and the Grecian antique, this chart not only reified the notion that Europeans were the most advanced segment of modern humanity, it reinforced the harmful and racist belief that Africans were the most animalistic of the human species. And then the last example I have there is the 1871 Descent of Man. So you might be a little bit more familiar with this one. In this text, Charles Darwin applied his theory of biological evolution to the human species and suggested that humans, like all other forms of life, evolved slowly from one common ancestor. And while this line of thinking did a lot to discredit earlier beliefs of religious creationism, so that great chain of being that I talked about in the previous slide, it did nothing to eliminate the notions of white supremacy. So like earlier scientists, Darwin also believed that there were, quote, gradations between the highest men, the highest races, and the lowest savages. So therefore, despite his contributions to the idea that all members of the human race can be traced back to one common ancestor, he reinforced a hierarchy that constituted white Europeans as physically and morally superior to all other races. So as I've demonstrated by these few examples, white European men used science to position themselves as politically, culturally, spiritually, and economically superior to all other races and genders. That being said, towards the end of the 1800s, it wasn't just race that was the concern of these scientists. So beginning around 1885, any form of unfitness, so conditions we now classify as poverty, addiction, same-sex desire, disability, etc., these were all to be eliminated from the Canadian population. So the result was the circulation of a number of new scientific knowledges that reinforced the development of various racist, heterosexist, and ableist programs and policies. So again, I've just got a few examples here. The first is vitality theory. So according to this medical theory, women were seen as chronically weak and had only finite mental and physical energy due to our menstruation. So as such, we needed to limit both mental and physical activity, which is why we weren't able to attend universities, do particular jobs, or participate in high-intensity sports. The second example there, which I introduced briefly, is eugenics. So eugenics was officially defined in 1883 as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of the generations, either physically or mentally. So basically what eugenics did was provide the scientific rationale necessary for a comprehensive network of policies and practices that would eliminate the unfit while simultaneously encouraging, quote, the best in all classes. So at the time we talked about these people as human thoroughbreds. In a Canadian context, this meant developing laws, policies, and practices that supported those deemed to be desirable and fit. So some examples could include pension programs, the unemployment insurance that I just talked about, farm settlement programs, or various public health campaigns, while at the same time developing a different set of laws, policies, and practices to eliminate, segregate, and reform those deemed undesirable or unfit. So some examples here could include mandatory sterilizations, forced institutionalizations, some of the racist immigration policies that we talked about, or residential schools is a great example here as well. And then the last example I have here is conjugal family theory. So this sociological theory outlines the roles and boundaries of the traditional family. So this is just a piece taken from a 1943 scientific paper, which states, the conjugal family unit of parents and children is one of basic significance. To be the main breadwinner of his family is the primary role of the normal adult man. Consequently, housekeeping and the care of the children is still the primary functional content of the adult feminine role. So as we can see from that passage, the normal family was, and in many cases still is, a heterosexual unit of two parents and their healthy offspring. At the head of the unit, an able-bodied man capable of success in the labor market and therefore capable of supporting his children and wife, who was expected to stay at home. Families that did not fit this definition were, and again in some ways still are, considered unworthy of the same family-based government supports. So, the big question now is, what the heck does all this have to do with public recreation? Well, I'm going to demonstrate that starting with our supervised playground movement. So our earliest playgrounds are often remembered as benevolent recreation sites where, quote, habits of health and social custom could be taught in a play atmosphere. And despite these seemingly positive characterizations, playgrounds were also sites where the logics of settler colonialism, racism, classism, heterosexism, and ableism were reinforced in a number of ways. So first of all, it's really important to note that the majority of men and women who campaigned for and ran supervised playgrounds were also avid supporters of the eugenics movement. So interested in ensuring the biological purity, which again basically meant the whiteness, straightness, and able-bodiedness of the Canadian population, these individuals believed playgrounds were sites where white, lower-class children could be inoculated against a number of biologically inherited pathologies. So at the time, there was a line of thinking that suggested things like poverty and criminality were biologically inherited. The overall goal in eliminating these pathologies was to make white lower-class children more fit for both industrial and domestic labor and less dangerous to the middle and upper classes. The focus on the white lower class is really important to note here. So by the time the playground movement started, almost all Indigenous peoples were living on reserves or in residential schools. Additionally, due to the use of racist immigration policies, the majority of immigrants were of Western European descent. So for example, in 1911, 97% of the population in Canada was of Western European descent, and that increased a little bit to 97.5 in 1921. Therefore, while our contemporary narratives suggest that playgrounds were sites for all vulnerable or at-risk children, the racial makeup of our settler colonial towns and cities was one of the major reasons lower-class white children were the targets of the playground movement. That being said, the racial makeup of our settler colonial towns and cities was not the only reason racialized children were absent from our earliest playgrounds. Racist tropes, such as the savage Indian and blackface minstrels, were also very common during playground games and performances. Such characters not only normalized racist attitudes, they also constructed a white Canadian identity that was opposed to the non-white other. So therefore, as I argued in my dissertation, even in the absence of explicit racialized exclusions, it can be assumed that non-white children would be hesitant to voluntarily attend programming that suggested they were inferior or degenerate others. In addition to reinforcing the racist notion that white people are superior to non-white people, playgrounds also reinforce the notion that men are superior to women and society should be organized as such. So within this line of thinking, lower-class boys were to become fit for wage labor and or military duty. Team games and sporting competitions were therefore used to teach physical efficiency, a respect for authority, and a loyalty to the British Crown. Lower-class girls, on the other hand, were taught proper domestic habits through instruction in sewing, knitting, and crafts. Non-strenuous activities, so that is those that were believed to be safe for our reproductive systems, such as dance, gymnastics, and other appropriate games, were also used in an attempt to strengthen our bodies for our future maternal duties. So while it's not inaccurate to suggest that playgrounds were intended to teach working-class children the habits of health and social custom, a deeper reading of these recreational sites allows us to see how the habits and customs that were actually taught reinforced white supremacist logics, which gave priority to white people, men and boys, marriage and heterosexuality, able working bodies, and Christianity. So moving on to swimming pools. So like playgrounds, our earliest swimming pools are often positioned as sites intended to improve the health and hygiene of the working class. Once again, however, I'm going to demonstrate that our earliest swimming pools also served other objectives of the settler colonial state through racialized and classed exclusions. So racialized exclusions were largely justified by a racist myth that non-white people, especially black people, were carriers of diseases that would, quote, ooze off in the water and mongrelize Europeans. So contact between white and racialized individuals was therefore controlled using a number of bylaws. So for example, in Edmonton, where I'm from, we had a 1923 bylaw banning all black people from swimming pools. We also used other segregation measures, including white-only areas or white-only schedules. In addition to these racialized exclusions, the pay-to-play model, adopted by our earliest public swimming pools, also served as an exclusionary measure, much like it does today. We talk a lot about pay-to-play in current recreation conversations. To demonstrate this, we can look at Toronto's Harrison Baths. So opening in 1909, these public swimming and bathing facilities were intended for Toronto's lower classes and were therefore strategically located just a few blocks away from what was described as the city's most notorious slum. And given this location and the target demographic, it's often assumed by contemporary recreation professionals that access to these public facilities was free. But that was not actually the case. In order to prevent what one Toronto alderman described as abuse of privilege and also provide a revenue to help meet current expenses, so these are arguments we hear in Alberta all the time. I'm not sure if they're things you hear in Quebec. Admission fees were charged. So in 1909, entry to the pool was 10 cents. This increased to 15 cents in 1919 and 25 cents in 1924. These amounts are roughly the equivalent of between $2.50 and $3.75 today. Again, these costs are comparable to what many swimming pools charge right now. It's also worth noting that these admission fees were not limited to indoor bathhouses. Outdoor swimming pools, which became very popular across Canada after World War I, also charged an admission fee. So for example, Toronto's Sunnyside Pool charged 35 cents for a single adult admission in 1922. That's the equivalent of around $5.19 today. So once again, as I argued in my book, despite being provided for through the public budget, swimming pools were always designed to serve a primarily white private buyer. All right, so as I've demonstrated up until this point, from the early 1900s until the early 1930s, playgrounds and swimming pools were used as a technique of social reform, primarily intended for the white lower classes. After World War II, however, recreation's objectives changed. So responding to concerns about Hitler's eugenics program, as well as the way the Nazi regime used recreational programming to cultivate soldiers, many local recreationists began to reject state-sponsored activities by suggesting that health and social reform should be left to healthcare providers and social workers. The result was the emergence of a new professional field, so one that positioned recreation as freely chosen, self-directed activity to be pursued by individual consumers. So very close to the definition that we use today. However, as other recreation historians have noted, the freely choosing, self-directing individual consumer was neither classless, genderless, nor raceless. From the late 1940s until the late 1970s, facility allocation and programming were developed according to the express needs of middle-class white men and boys. So to demonstrate this, we can look at a passage from an academic paper about Edmonton's Community League rinks, which states, despite having nearly 2,000 girls enrolled in figure skating programs in 1964, only 64 hours per year of indoor ice was allocated to these programs. Outdoor rinks were substandard for serious sports like boys hockey, but perfectly suitable for less important and fringe sports such as girls figure skating. So this passage, although specific to community league ice rinks, is a perfect example of how gender-based power relations were reinforced during Canada's community centre movement. Not only was hockey prioritized over figure skating, the fact that hockey was deemed a boys' sport and figure skating was deemed a girls' sport reinforced the heterosexist discourses which reduced girls to future wives and mothers and suggested they were biologically, anatomically, and temperamentally unfit for intense competitive sport. It's also worth noting that in addition to reinforcing the sexist notion that women were inferior to men, ice rinks also excluded lower class and racialized individuals, and they did this in two ways. The first was location. So because these facilities were predominantly located in suburban neighborhoods, they excluded many non-white and lower class people simply by virtue of their socioeconomic geography. And the second was lack of public or low-cost opportunities. So in the 1960s and 70s, many indoor rinks eliminated public skating as, quote, an economy measure. So as a result, individuals had to be a member of a figure skating club or an amateur hockey team, activities where participants were and remain almost entirely white and middle to upper class, to access these publicly funded facilities. So therefore, just as playgrounds and swimming pools reinforced the white supremacist logics of capitalism, racism, sexism, and heteropatriarchy, so too did the community recreation centers that were primarily developed by white settlers for white settlers. between the late 1940s and late 1970s. In this new configuration, however, these investments were no longer intended to improve the physical and moral health of the white lower classes in an attempt to make them more fit for labor and less dangerous to the middle and upper classes. Instead, community recreation was now seen as a way to maximize the health and individual freedoms of the white middle class in an effort to improve their quality of life in a democratic society. So returning now to this contemporary discussion about the rise of neoliberalism and the negative impacts of our current consumer-based recreation system, we can see that there are reasons to be critical of how our traditional histories have romanticized the field's inclusive roots. As I've demonstrated, from the early 1900s until the late 1970s, playgrounds, swimming pools, and community recreation centers, like all other areas of settler colonial society, reinforced a number of white supremacist logics, which again gave priority to white people, men and boys, marriage and heterosexuality, able working bodies, Christianity, and the economy. Therefore, while the neoliberal principles of profitability, efficiency, and individualism have indeed contributed to the exclusion of equity-denied groups, these are only a few of the many logics that have created the conditions for recreation systems that continue to exclude. And again, this is by the recreation sector's own admission on pages 22 and 23 of the Framework for Recreation. Children and youth from disadvantaged families, older adults who are frail and or isolated, women and girls of all backgrounds, individuals from diverse and racialized backgrounds, persons with disabilities, Aboriginal peoples, and individuals with non-normative gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientations, and sexual identities. To suggest otherwise, as the recent calls to return to an inclusive past tend to do, not only ignores the ways the logics of settler colonialism, capitalism, racism, ableism, and heteropatriarchy have shaped our public recreation settings, it also fails to acknowledge how each of these oppressive and harmful logics are actually interrelated components of white supremacy. So it's therefore my argument that in order to actually advance this call to increase inclusion and access to recreation, we must challenge the nostalgic tendencies that position earlier forms of public recreation as sites of equal opportunity and acknowledge the ways our sector has been and continues to be entangled in the various components of white supremacy. In other words, we must recognize that a whole host of logics, policies, and practices which appear to be unrelated to recreation and sport have actually created the conditions for a recreation system that not only excludes most members of Canadian society, but also increasingly values profit over participation. All right, so what do we do with all of this information? Recognizing I am not here to offer any prescriptive actions or solutions, as I myself do not have the answers to hundreds of years of settler colonialism, I would argue that the first thing we need to do is accept that we do have a responsibility for writing the next chapter of history. Yes, you and I are not responsible for the policies and practices of the past. We can't change what happened, but we also can't continue to deny that it did happen. We can't continue to ignore the ways white supremacy, again, meaning settler colonialism, racism, heterosexism, ableism, and exploitative capitalism, shaped and continue to shape all aspects of Canadian society. We also can't continue to justify the ways some people have benefited and continue to benefit from Indigenous genocide, racist immigration policies, and the many other policies and practices that reinforce the notion that certain groups are superior or more valuable than others. So in closing, I'm just going to offer two strategies that might act as starting points for creating more accessible, equitable, and just recreation and sport systems. The first is do your work of learning and unlearning. If we are truly interested in creating more equitable and inclusive recreation spaces, those of us with decision-making authority must undergo an ongoing process of critical reflection. So in other words, we must slow down and engage, both individually and collectively, with our nation's colonizing and supremacist history, with the overall goal of understanding how these harmful pieces of our past actually continue to shape the policies, practices, and people in our present. As the philosopher and social activist Grace Lee Boggs noted, lasting social change requires that people not only struggle against existing institutions, but that they also make a philosophical and a spiritual leap to become more human beings. So in other words, if we want to transform our recreation systems, we must first transform ourselves. And then the second strategy I'll offer is to address the myth that recreation is apolitical. We know two of the biggest factors affecting participation are time and money. We've known this for decades now. Yet as a sector, we remain uninvolved in the political efforts that would allow for increases in both of these areas. So we don't really engage in conversations about living wage legislation, tax reform, minimum wage increases, childcare legislation. So therefore, instead of addressing the systemic issues that could actually give people more time and money, we tend to develop surface-level reforms that attempt to remove barriers at the individual or organizational level. So for example, the two most common interventions we make in a recreation space are time-consuming grant programs that cover registration fees. So good examples of these are the low-income passes at a municipal recreation center or kid sport grants. Or we make investments in activities that provide only brief moments of participation. So things like sports sampling days or short-term program grants for activities that only run 1 year. Choosing to focus on these surface-level reforms while avoiding strategic discussions about social justice is a political statement of its own. If we are truly interested in creating more equitable and inclusive recreation spaces, we need to acknowledge that recreation is political and find common cause with the political agendas that will actually contribute to reducing the structural barriers we know limit participation. And then finally, just before I wrap up, I also think it's really important to emphasize that this rereading of public recreation's history is not intended, nor does it provide a complete historical picture. It's also not intended to suggest that all recreation programs and policies are inherently harmful. I do this work because I love recreation. I've benefited from recreation. There's a lot of resistance that happens in recreation spaces, so that is not the message that I'm trying to portray at all. So I hope you don't take that away. Rather, what I've intended to do is demonstrate, or is to suggest that each slice of history should be read as part of a larger historical mosaic that has been pieced together in an attempt to encourage recreation and health professionals to be brave enough to acknowledge Canada's colonizing and supremacist history and open enough to begin to explore new, more equitable policies and practices. Or to once again use the words of Robin Kelly, this rereading of public recreation history is intended to do what great poetry always does, transport us to another place, compel us to relive horrors, and more importantly, enable us to imagine a new society. Thank you.